Welcome to the Red Bull Theater Podcast, where guests discuss all things classical theater with your host, Nathan Winkelstein.
Welcome to the Red Bull Theater Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Winkelstein, and I am so thrilled to welcome today one of our great living stage actors, a man who has appeared in more shows on and off Broadway and on television than one can count, nominated for both an Emmy and a Tony. He is a chameleon performer, and he is, of course, the wonderful Bill Camp. Hi, Bill. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the pod.
Of course, Nathan. This is a privilege. Thank you.
No, well, it is a privilege for me as well. And today you've agreed to take a look at the role of Hal from Henry V, and of course wider from the Henry IV tetralogy, a role you tackled a few years ago at ART in a production directed by Ron Daniels. And of course, Hal is the character with the most lines in the entire canon. And we only have an hour, so we will be honing in on a particular starting point. And in this case, that starting point is his incredible speech at the beginning of Henry V, Act 1, Scene 2, for those of you following along in a script. And this is the famous tennis ball speech where Hal, who is now Henry V, has sent to France, claiming to be the rightful king of France. And he has received the Dauphin's message back to him, which is that no, he doesn't get to be the king of France, but what he does get is a gift of tennis balls. And this is Hal's response.
We are glad. The Dauphin is so pleasant with us. His present and your pains we thank you for. When we have matched our rackets to these balls, we will, in France, by God's grace, play a set, shall strike his father's crown into the hazard. Tell him he hath made a match with such a wrangler that all the courts of France will be disturbed with chases. And we understand him well, how he comes o'er us with our wilder days, not measuring what use we made of them. We never valued this poor seat of England, and therefore living hence did give ourselves to barbarous license, as 'tis ever common that men are merriest when they are from home. But tell the Dauphin I will keep my state, be like a king, and show my sail of greatness when I do rouse me in my throne of France. For that I have laid by my majesty and plotted like a man for working days, but I will rise there with so full a glory that I will dazzle all the eyes of France. Yea, strike the Dauphin blind to look on us, and tell the pleasant prince this mock of his hath turned his balls to gunstones, and his soul shall stand sore charged for the vasteful vengeance that shall fly with them. For many a thousand widows shall this his mock out of their dear husbands, mock mothers from their sons, mock castles down, and some are yet ungotten and unborn that shall have cause to curse the Dauphin's scorn. But this lies all within the will of God, to whom I do appeal, and in whose name tell you, the Dauphin, I am coming on, to venge me as I may, and to put forth my rightful hand in a well-hallowed cause. So, get you hence, in peace, and tell the Dauphin his jest will savour but of shallow wit, when thousands weep more than did laugh at it. Convey them with safe conduct, Very well.
Thank you, Bill. That was wonderful. So I have to ask right off the bat, it's really fascinating listening to you do this speech. And when I reached out to you about this character, it had been 30 years since you had attacked this role before. And
Yep.
what was it about looking at wanting to do this speech and thinking about this character? What was it that most came back to you about, I guess, for lack of a better way of the question, what makes Hal Hal? Like, what did you find as you were re-digging into him was the most operative element of him? Because he's one of these massive characters who's so hard to encompass that I was curious if anything specifically struck you looking back at him.
I think in this particular speech, which I remember you said you loved so much, and I was trying to remember when we did it, he's still so green. And I can't help but feel like, the world that he had been living in. And I know in the beginning of Henry I, he says, the speech of I know you all in redeeming time and shining again. I'll imitate the sun. That's all still an abstract. Do you know what I mean? That's not like, I mean, he really means it, and that's his intention. But, who knows what's going to happen? We don't know. And so I feel like now we've traversed all of these events in this time, and the scenes with his father and then banishment. I just don't believe that he's cauterized that old Hal. And I know we find, a little touch of Harry in The Night Later, and then we have the wonderful scene with Kate where his humor comes out. I guess in this particular speech, I'm interested in, or was thinking, like, what a great opportunity this would have been for, like, how would he have given this speech if he was sitting over in Eastcheap? If he and Falstaff were playing this scene out? If they had, well, like, how would he have handled that? And there's a certain, I guess, kind of personal internal humor, even though he's been insulted so like hugely. I mean, and I know it's an insult of state now, but in a way he's such a pro at that, in terms of being insulted and going with it and throwing the insult back, finding a path or doors in which to then reverse the table. And here there's something of the Hal in this speech, I guess is what I'm saying, that is sort of interesting. And I don't know if, like, he's on the verge in a way. He's not, even though this is such a, it's such a speech has such momentum. He kind of gets carried away, and we have a yay in the middle of the speech where he's just on a roll, and he knows. But it's also, oddly, to me, it's a kind of foreshadowing of Harfleur, where that's such a brutal speech, and he's like, who is this guy now? You know, and that speech he gives to the mayor of Harfleur of just decimating everybody.
Yeah, the I love how you put it, kind of that his greenness and him being on the verge, because and I heard it in the way you read it right here, and it is something, one of the reasons I love this speech so much, you mentioned that it's a favorite of mine, is exactly what you're describing. Is sometimes we see, especially when Henry V is being performed in isolation, we forget who Hal is, and seeing this young man who has just been insulted in front of his court by the Prince of France, and he needs to respond not just to the
But
Dauphin,
it's
but to
not
the
even the
court.
prince. He's not even there, it's a messenger.
Right.
And so, and in his world, in in these working days he's talking about, right? In that time, everything's been face to face with the basically, because people live that way. Whereas in this world, it's here I get it's less so. It's more oblique in terms of the way court communicates and the way these countries. It's like I don't know. I just sort of that occurred to me. It was like he's having to adapt to a world where even I can't be insulted by the person who's giving me the insult. I know the ambassador represents him, but it's like this Dauphin, who we find out, who is really just, a lot of hot air,
Right.
if that. And I played him once. I played him in school, and I had such a blast playing that guy. Um,
He's so fun. He's such a hoot.
it's that too, I think. So there's so much boiling inside of him right here. And he certainly doesn't, who would expect what he gets with the tennis balls and like that? And this is his first kind of act in terms of diplomacy. Or,
That's
do you
one
know
word
what I
for it.
mean?
Yeah.
That's right, exactly. And yeah, so yeah, I think it's a very fine edge that he's having to try and I think he has to catch himself or at least try or it consider catching, but I don't know if he really succeeds at that, you know.
Well, and that's another thing that I find so interesting about the speech is it's very hard to tell in the play. It's very hard to tell how he did, right? Because to me, I think it is very unlikely with the translation of English to French and a messenger sitting there in the court that the messenger is going to bring back to Dauphin all of these puns that Hal is laying out. It feels to, and I'd be curious how you take this, that one of the things that has always interested me about this speech is that he is in his council chamber with older, more experienced British lords, and that a big part of this response is actually he is responding to
Impressing them.
them
Yeah.
more than like they're all going, how is this young, fiery person going to respond to this insult and to be called out to being called out for being that young, fiery person? And so I've always seen this as a very interesting test that Hal walks of, I'm not going to take this insult sitting down, but I'm also not going to, I'm going to try not to blow my gasket either. I'm going to try to walk this interesting line. And I always think it's a very interesting choice for a director and an actor to make of how do the other Brits, how do the other British people in the room receive this? Is this a great speech? Has he passed his test? Or
A
has
merry
he
message. What does that mean?
right? And like, is that like you might have gone too far, or is it like that's awesome, man? Like we've never
Well, it's
seen a
interesting. You
king
could
do
also,
comedy.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you could make it just, I mean, that's the thing is that depending on your how,
Right.
or depending how you as a director want to go with it, it could be, he could just be riffing, the
Right.
whole time with his brilliant wit, and it could all just be, these. It could be almost like with a smile throughout the whole thing. You could do it. I
Right.
mean, it can be done that way.
Yeah, well, what
I
you're
mean,
saying
I
now,
believe, or it can be also complicated in terms of, he's dealing with, as I said before, he's still in a way. I think one has to, you know, playing the role, and I can remember talking to Ron about it and arguing with him somewhat of not when maybe it was because I just had so much fun as Hal, and this is a kind of he's steely and cold, or he's trying to bring that into himself because he needs to do that as king, and we've seen it happen with the banishment, and then it's like, oh my God, this is a totally different guy. But I also don't believe, I think Shakespeare knew that people are more complicated than that, and that I don't think he's, I don't know. I don't know, able to, maybe because I can't really compartmentalize that sense of self or being or identity that one would think might be the case. I don't think he's really cut that part of himself entirely off. I think that's the struggle. I think that's as you said too, that's, that's the more complicated choice, I think, and how to do that in a way that is more probably nuanced than I read it, but it was also, just more it's just more interesting to me. That's all.
No,
And
and I
finding the parts where you see that guy almost, really having to put this identity on,
and this is,
you know.
I love what you're saying, because people, I think, forget. I'll speak for myself. I always forget how much Henry V is a star vehicle play. Like, we don't think of it in quite the same terms as a Hamlet or even a Macbeth, but he talks so much in that play. He has so many speeches, and to just see someone who's nailed it do a bunch of speeches doesn't make as much sense to me as someone who is, as you say, dancing this line of, I'm not my father. My father, frankly, was a little bit too uptight of a king, and upset people that way. And so I am this sort of charismatic, funny person, but I also can't be what I was in Eastcheap. And him, because the other speech that we forget about is, like, this one is him kind of using his wit and being playful in that way. You mentioned Harfleur, where he, like, experiments with the other side, like, what is it to be brutal? And there's that other one in the middle, which is not as famous, but I find brilliant, which is the "What should I say to thee, Lord Scroop,"
Yeah. Oh my
where,
gosh. Yeah, yeah,
which is just so human. That speech is so,
yeah,
it
yeah.
starts so political, but it becomes so human and emotional. And we see this man struggle with how much of that he can show and how much of that he's allowed to do. And it
Yeah, because that's
culminates
a
in,
really public speech too,
yes,
you know?
yes. And dealing with a very personal issue of, like, you were my friend and you betrayed me, but I have to do this in the public sphere. And so I
Yeah.
love what you're saying about how many of these first speeches are Hal trying to find his way. And in some ways, that makes Band of Brothers a true culmination where he finds the balance. He finds this great charismatic. He's a little funny at the top of that speech when he's calling out the one lord who wishes he was at home, but then he's charismatic and he's uplifting, and he nails it. And it's interesting to see him be flawed before that and figuring that. So I love how you're talking about that. How did you? So I know you did the Hals, the Henry IV Part One and Part Two, a couple of years before you did the Henry V. I imagine that was
I
it
think it was a
mostly?
year. I'm not sure. You could look it up. I think it was 95. I don't know how the the timelines work out, but it was,
Right.
yeah, I did As You Like It, and that was about, maybe that was between the Henrys. I did a play at the Hasty Pudding before As You Like It, so I was there all of 94 into 95, and then yeah, I think I came back and we started rehearsal for the Henry V sometime in the winter, like late winter at ART in 95.
Did did they overlap? I know at that point it was a true repertory company. Did they, the roles that continued forward from one show to the next, were all of the other roles also the same actors, or was it a slightly different? Like, did you have the same Bardolph and the same?
Yeah,
um yeah,
yeah,
that's
because they
cool.
had a company, and they had a company of brilliant character actors. And or just actors. They had a company of actors that had probably done, over the years, 3 or 4 more times the plays that I had done. I was only 4 years out of school, and it was a brilliant company. It was Tommy Dara, I'm not going to remember everybody, but Alvin Epstein and Jeremy Geit and Will LeBeau, Remo Araldi, Karen McDonald, so many people. The company, Royal Miller, I want to say Stephanie Roth had just left. But yeah, I mean, you had some people that were just insanely talented and, had already were so experienced and so like they had chops, man. Like they knew what the F they were doing. And as a company that's, as somebody coming into a company and young and not really, having a kind of intellectual idea of some stuff coming out of a place like Juilliard, and it was the best, they just embraced me, and I learned so much from those people, just talking. And so when we came back to do it, yeah, same company. Couple of other people came in, played Dauphin, and Ben Halley Jr. came in to play Pistol. Yeah, it was Maggie Rush, was Lady Percy,
Such a brilliant role.
and Doll Tearsheet
Yeah. Now
becomes Blubbered.
we so rarely they just did it at the Guthrie where they did
Five,
did they do
all of
the
them.
entire tetralogy or just the Henry Ford's Henry Fives?
I
But
don't know.
and it is one of those well, it is a tetralogy, but really the trilogy of the two Henry Fords and the Henry Five is from our whole conversation. I wish more companies were able to do them in consecutive order, even if there's a year or two apart, because it does seem like whether it's for the character Hal in terms of feeding off of everything that's come before, or in terms of like Bardolph, who, if you don't know Bardolph, the killing of him in Henry V isn't as sad. Whereas if you know the trilogy, the killing of Bardolph is catastrophic. It's so upsetting. And I wonder, of course, because you haven't done it the other way, I don't know how you're really going to answer this question, but how helpful was it to be able to practically have done Henry IV and Henry IV Part One and Two before doing Henry V, instead of just kind of researching those plays and jumping into the deep end of Henry V, like, which is what a lot of actors are asked to do today. Like, do you think that it helped? A softball question, I guess, but do you think it helped you to be able to do the entire trilogy somewhat consecutively?
Absolutely. Of course, because it's just experience and getting to know, getting to know those people, and live in that world. Now, and the design and everything stayed very consistent. I think John Conklin did all 3 sets for all 3 shows. And I think it was Gabriel Barry did all 3 clothes. But of course, I mean, that's just a no-brainer. It's the more knowledge, right? The more information and knowledge one has with not just speaking those words, but trying to inhabit as best one can a particular character with that in the poetry and the prose, just does nothing but support, moving into five for everybody, not just me, but for everybody, like everybody that was in one and two, then going into five,
Except for
certainly.
Falstaff.
Because we had we sort of breathed the air of those first 2 productions and the world that we were inhabiting and the dynamics of what each of us was making in terms of character. And the soul of those 2 plays together, one and two, right? The soul of those, which so much of these things, these plays, these words, all of it, that he made, Shakespeare, or whoever you want to say did it, is really the goal. It's
Totally.
the fight, with yourself and integrating one's own soul into these things. And that's why I find, you know, it's malleable that way, you know,
Yeah.
and that's why I always back off when I'm sort of it's like, oh, that's the way to do it, and that's the way it should be heard, and that's the way you move on for it. And it's like, I just feel like, if one can embrace and wrap your sort of internal life, one's own personal internal life around these words, however that's done, however it's done, then you're cool. And it's going to be conveyed and conveyed in a way that an audience member is going to lean into it and be like, "Oh my God, I know what that feels like," or that phrase or word or sound is just the perfect way to describe. I know that. I know that. And I don't think there's it's music. It's like listening to a piece of music, that way. And, it's hard. It's like it's not an easy thing to achieve, and sadly, it's a kind of dying vernacular or language or skill. I feel that's how I feel. As a 60-year-old man now, as opposed to when I was a 20, 25-year-old or 27-year-old. Yeah, definitely. Definitely, Nathan. Those first two and that experience, I could have done five, we could have done five 2 years later, not, a year later. 2 years later still would have been great. Even if I was asked to do five now, it would that experience would have helped me and will help me,
Yeah.
if I was to do that. Because
May I
again, it's
ask?
like,
No, I was going to ask because you mentioned, and I think it's important. You talked about wrapping yourself around these words, or kind of finding how to do that, and whether or not it's a dying art or not, or a changing art. I am, without it going into, because one podcast is not enough time to teach somebody how to do Shakespeare. But for you, what is sort of the reductive version of how you tend to tackle wrapping yourself around these words of Shakespeare's? Like, what's most important to you in that process when you attack this language?
I have to know, I have to have an understanding of what it is I'm saying. What is the meaning, just intellectually, as a very base level. And then I have to know why I say these things. And there's so much, there are so many movements of thought, which is why it's pure thought. And I have to get on that track. I have to be able to, but then also after repetition, 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 and kind of, I guess, for lack of a better term, analyzing or looking at where does that thought pause? Where does that thought get lost? Where are the moments which are usually like 99.9% of the time there already in the text, in either the grammar or the rhythm and the meter, but in that thought. But then I also don't necessarily always want to be restricted by that in terms of those things that may be in there, because I can't entirely trust all of that stuff either, because it's all a transcription. And so, and I've also seen actors give new, almost more illumined meaning, or open up a wider landscape to a line, an iambic that I never knew, because they didn't follow something, they actually did something that was so inventive. It just kind of like, wow, if that makes sense. But yeah, what am I saying? Why am I saying? And also how these, I absolutely need to find, certainly irregularities in the scansion and do that sort of analysis, but also find the music of the rhythm of it and how these pure thoughts, because it really is like, not that it like it just motors along, and sort of, which I hear a lot of, I feel, I don't know, but that the thought, that's where I find the discovery of the thoughts in experimenting with the kind of music and the rhythm of it and the rhythm of those thoughts, if that makes any sense at all. I'm so inarticulate when it comes to, because it's again, it's about embracing my own self, sort of grafting myself to what is there, you know, what those words are. And if I can certainly understand what they are intellectually and the meaning of them, and then what could bring that person to have to say that parenthetical thought before this one and this, do you know, and choose that word. Then if I can integrate those two things, myself to the soul of the words, the poetry, then I'm sort of at least halfway there. And then I can maybe get on my feet and start moving around and then playing with others who've done the same thing. And then it gets really electric and cool, because we're talking in a language which we all understand. I mean, it's why it's so attractive, is that when you hear it and you hear it really well done, it's just like they're just talking to each other. They're not, there's we can all understand it. Yeah.
It's great. It's great, Bill. And the I mean, what I am hearing, tell me if I'm reducing this incorrectly. What I'm hearing, and you'll be, I guess, pleased to know that this is, at least of the people who make it on the podcast, not in opposition with how some of them think about it as well, is like, you have to know what you're saying. There's no negotiation about that. You have to know what the words mean. And importantly, which I do think you kind of talked about how things maybe are fading today in certain ways. But I loved that the next thing you emphasized before getting into the how am I going to do it, is I have to know why I'm saying it. Is that at the end of the day, I forget who it was who said it, but he was like, they were like, I'm not allowed to open my mouth unless I know why I'm saying the next thing I'm saying. Otherwise, why am I opening my mouth? And that then the how, all of the verse and all of that stuff is all helpful. And we could negotiate until the cows come home exactly how to utilize the verse, but is all helpful for helping to find that why and helping to find your way through it and to play the jazz, to play the music of Shakespeare. Sort of sounds like, and I love that you keep using music as the kind of metaphor for that, because that's always been how it's felt to me, is it's like really good jazz. You're not really paying
Yeah.
attention to the drummer doing the trochaic beat in the back of jazz, but it does exist in order for the saxophonist to play amazingly, in order for the guitarist to play amazingly, is they have all of that, but they also have their own freedom, personal freedom of expression.
Yeah, and like any great, jazz musician, the more you play and the more you practice, then you kind of fall into the music. And then and it's like a person who really knows how to do this verse well, or any verse, or sort of heightened language well, dramatic language, even poetry, although that's a different thing. That's a kind of, in a way, falls into the language. Does that make sense? It's not
yes.
like you no longer are, like you said, with Henry V, it's such a star vehicle. There are so many things now. Hamlet, Henry V, Macbeth, it's like, and then it's kind of like, oh, well, here's the spotlight, and now how is this guy gonna do this? Or this woman's gonna do, Margaret, or who's gonna do whatever, as opposed to the falling into the language where it's like, I don't know who this person is, and I don't really care, but I'm listening to what they're saying.
Right.
In terms of, identifying with the speech as opposed to identifying with that individual person, because what's most important is the speech.
So that's really interesting because I
Do you
was
know, because it's for the audience, and so we should serve those. I mean, this is what an actor should do in the first place every time. Whether it's like Edward Albee, whether it's anybody, you know, contemporary, modern, Jacobean, whatever it may be, it's just serving what they wrote. So we are, in a way, this is just what I believe. I mean, that we are being of service to what someone else wrote and took the time and took whatever, you know, it cost them. Because there's always a price, right? When you make something, especially like that, writing a play or what, you know, then a really good one. And then we are just there to serve that, I think, as opposed to, you know, using it as a badge of identity of whatever that is as actor, you know. And I guess that's my way of saying that I love it when I see somebody just almost vanish as like, here's a human being, just a human being, saying these incredibly moving, you know, nurturing, uplifting, beautiful words, for lack of a better term, or extremely terrifying words in the form of poetry. And that's all I'm hearing, you know, not entirely, obviously, because there is the person in front of me. But when that happens, then I'm engaged in a different way, which I find that that moment, right? Why we love theater is that we're all in the same room, breathing that same air, and something happens in that room, regardless of where you are. You could also be in a little park at Carroll Park up the street or in a classroom, and it just goes, even for like 5 seconds. That's why I love it. Because I find that like, oh, okay, there's hope or there's something, you know, there's hope for us.
I love
Because
that, Bill.
that kind of goodness is, you know, I think essential, especially now, you know, or we're lost, man. But we are capable of that. And I think that's where it's a true privilege to be able to engage with, you know, to have this as a form of service. And I don't know. I heard somebody reading All the World's a Stage, Jake Weiss, and it was a really old guy, and I knew this guy, but I didn't know him as he was doing it. I mean, it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life. And it wasn't, he was just reading it. He was just like reading it, you know, but he knew what he was reading. He knew what it meant, and he really knew why these things were, you know, because you know, he was also an 80-year-old man. He knew exactly what, you know, not that like a 35, 40-year-old couldn't do it brilliantly too, but in a different way. And anyways, this guy, he just fell into the words, and it was so moving. It was just, you know, it just lifted my heart to experience it. It was like, oh man, wow, how lucky am I to like be able to hear that right now, and that it exists. And I know I'm waxing like my dad would say something, but I feel very strongly about it, especially now, you know. And I wish that it was something that we did more. I wish there were more productions happening. You know, you guys are amazing in terms of what you make and how you focus on the language of great pieces of dramatic art.
That was beautiful, Bill. I feel like we've got like a couple of different titles for our podcast into that. I don't know if it's be of service or fall into the language. But and it was very interesting to hear because early I was going to bring it up that earlier you had spoken about wrapping yourself around the language, bringing yourself to the language. And it's you are of course famously known for being a wonderful character actor, for kind of disappearing into whatever character you do. And so it was very nice to hear you sort of explicate that a little bit, that it's not bring X and Y character to me, it's bring me to them, and give myself what you're talking about, that service, to give myself over to them. And it takes, I'm sure, immense courage and empathy in order to be able to do that. Really lovely and inspiring to hear you talk about that.
I don't know. It's just a great job.
That's why you get paid the big bucks to do it.
Right. Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, it's like, it's a privilege, Trust me, I really do, I'm grateful that I can do this and keep doing it, and hopefully I can keep doing it and be part of the same world that you guys are doing. So it's cool.
Well, this has been a privilege, Bill, to have you on. Thank you for exploring this role so deeply and for agreeing to come on. It means a lot to me, and it means a lot to Red Bull Theater to have you on. And I know I've already taken enough of your time, so thank you again so much. And our revels now are ended. That's the end. Until next time.
Until next time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Red Bull Theater podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcasting platform. Your support helps us to bring you more captivating conversations and insights into the world of classic theater. To stay updated on our latest activities, follow us on social media, get on our mailing list, and visit www.redbulltheater.com, where you'll find an abundance of podcasts, readings, classes, seminars, productions, and more. Your support makes all of this possible, so please consider making a tax-deductible donation on our website to help us continue bringing classical theater to contemporary audiences. Until next time, thanks, and ever thanks.